In the beginning, the breath of life newly placed in Adam and Eve still echoed over the earth. But paradise had been lost, and the weight of sin already pressed heavily upon the shoulders of newborn humanity. Outside of Eden, hardened soil, sweat-soaked brows, and the pains of childbirth had become inescapable parts of existence. Yet, amid the growing shadows, hope still blossomed, the promise that one day a descendant would crush the serpent's head and restore what had been broken. It was in this landscape of sorrow and expectation that Cain and Abel were born. Two brothers, two destinies, two hearts laid bare before the God who sees all. Here begins humanity's first tragedy, a story not merely of bloodshed, but of the eternal battle between surrendering to the Creator and falling prey to sin. Before we continue this journey through the eternal pages of the Word, subscribe to Deep Bible Chronicles. Strengthen your faith, deepen your understanding, and walk with us through a story that never grows old. The birth of Cain and Abel, two destinies unfolded. Time had only just begun to mark its days upon a world, scarred by the recent fall. Amid the sorrow of a lost Eden, Adam and Eve, now exiled, experienced for the first time both the gift and the pain of bringing forth life. Through unfamiliar pains, Eve gave birth to Cain, and her words carried hope and acknowledgement. With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man. In the womb of the woman shaped from dust, the continuity of the human race blossomed, but so too, invisibly, germinated the seeds of future tragedy. Soon after, Abel was born. Two children, two brothers, two futures unfolding, like diverging roads beneath the same sky. Cain, the firstborn, became a farmer, laboring over a cursed ground, his sweat mingling with the stubborn soil beneath his feet. Abel, by contrast, tended flocks, caring for living creatures, silent witnesses to a creation not yet fully corrupted. Their occupations, simple to human eyes, hinted at far deeper contrasts, not in the work of their hands, but in the hidden mysteries of their hearts. In time, it became clear that what the soil and the flocks could not reveal, their souls would. Two paths, two spirits. Cain, bearer of the promise of redemption that Adam and Eve may have longed to see fulfilled, carried within him not only hope, but also the silent corruption that had not been erased by Eden's gates. Abel, by contrast, seemed to carry within his soul a spark of reverent fear and true worship, a heart seeking to please the Creator not out of duty, but out of love. Thus, in the earliest chapters of human history, two destinies began to take shape, not by the strength of earthly professions, but by the unseen inclinations of hearts fully exposed before the gaze of God. The earth, once a pure cradle of life, would also become the stage where the deepest struggles of the human soul would unfold, scenes of love, faith, envy, and blood. In the midst of that small family, the drama of all humanity was about to manifest itself in its rawest, most painful form. Man's tragic inability to conquer the sin crouching at his door. Through Cain and Abel, God allowed mankind to see, even in its first breath of existence, the battle each generation would inherit. The struggle between humble surrender and proud resistance, between worship that pleases God and empty rituals that try to bargain with heaven. Two brothers, one choice, life or death, blessing or curse, but the heart of man, even from the very beginning, revealed its tragic tendency to choose the way that leads to death rather than the path that gives life. The stage was set, and the next act of this story would rise from the growing tension that only the all-seeing eyes of God could discern. The birth of Cain and Abel, though celebrated as a sign of life's continuation, would inevitably become the prelude to humanity's first great tragedy. The offerings before God, the heart behind the sacrifice. Time passed, and the brothers grew up under the weight of the cursed earth and the vivid memory of lost. Eden passed down through stories told in the shadow of both fear and hope. A day came when, moved by something deeper than daily labor, they each decided to bring an offering before the Lord, not out of obligation, but because within the human heart, even wounded by sin, there still echoed the call to worship, imprinted from the moment of creation. Cain brought forth an offering from the fruits of the ground, the work of his hands earned through toil. His gift, though legitimate in human eyes, lacked the fervor born of true reverence. Abel, by contrast, chose the finest of his flocks, the firstborn and the fattest portions, symbols of excellence, of wholehearted surrender, and of recognition that everything belongs to God. It was never about the material of the offering, but about the spirit in which it was given. There, before the invisible altar, God looked beyond the visible sacrifice and into the heart of each worshiper. In Abel, he found faith and sincere devotion, the offering of one who trusted not in himself, but in the grace of the Most High. In Cain, he saw lifeless formality, a hollow work attempting to please God without a transformed heart. The Lord accepted Abel and his offering, but he rejected Cain and his sacrifice. His acceptance and rejection were not arbitrary, but clear responses to the inner posture of each heart. By offering the very best he had, Abel confessed his own smallness and total dependence on the Almighty. Cain, by offering merely the fruits of his labor, perhaps fulfilled a duty without ever laying open his soul before the Eternal. The rejection struck Cain like an open wound. His face darkened, his heart ignited with rage, but instead of turning toward God in repentance, Cain closed himself off in wounded pride. Instead of correcting his path, he nurtured bitterness. His rejected offering became an accusation against himself, and envy against Abel grew like a weed in untended soil. In that silent moment where two brothers stood before God, it became clear the true sacrifice the Most High desires is not something harvested, crafted, or earned by human hands. It is the broken and contrite spirit. The altar was not merely a place for offerings. It was a mirror where hearts were laid bare, either in the light of grace or the shadows of pride. As Abel left the Lord's presence accepted and justified by faith, Cain walked away, carrying a storm inside his chest. The first act had ended, and now a dark cloud hovered over the scene. For sin, crouching like a wild beast at the door, longed to devour the one who already refused to master his heart. The rejection of Cain's offering and the call to repentance. The silence that followed the rejection was thick and heavy, like the fog that settles before a storm. Cain, consumed by fury, walked like a man carrying a burning flame in his chest, unwilling to accept the verdict from on high. His twisted countenance betrayed the war raging within his soul. The altar, meant to be a place of reconciliation, had become for Cain a battlefield of resentment and shame. Then, the voice of the Lord broke through the heavy silence, but it did not come as thunder or sword. It came as a merciful appeal. Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? It was not a question seeking information, but a loving confrontation. The God who sees all was not asking to know, but inviting Cain to look within himself, to see the ruin forming in his heart. If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? With these simple words, the Most High opened the door to repentance. He offered Cain a way back, a call to master the evil already threatening to consume him. God's warning was grave and urgent. But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Sin, personified as a predatory beast, lurked nearby, ready to pounce. The image was clear. Sin was no mere mistake. It was a living, hungry force seeking to enslave the soul. Yet the responsibility remained Cain's. He must master it or be mastered. This warning was an act of grace. God stooped down to meet fallen man and offered him a choice, a chance to triumph over temptation, but the battle that should have taken place within Cain's heart was left unfought. Instead of wrestling with himself, Cain nourished the monster at his door. Anger took root in envy, envy in hatred, and hatred solidified into a desire for murder. The bridge of repentance had been laid across the abyss, but Cain, wounded in pride, chose instead to stare into the darkness of his own resentment. He did not seek God. He did not tear open his heart in repentance. He closed himself deeper within his own world of pain and disdain. The merciful gaze of God met in Cain not a broken spirit, but a heart hardened against transformation. It was the beginning of an irreversible decline. What could have been a new beginning became the prelude to a tragedy without return. The blood that still ran in Cain's veins was about to be spilled, not his own, but that of the one who had found favor with the Lord. Human history, though still so young, already bore the terrible weight of free choices and their eternal consequences. Cain was not just a man, he was a mirror reflecting the inner struggle. Every generation would face the battle between surrendering to sin or conquering it through faith and obedience. The invitation to sin and Cain's fatal decision. The seed of sin, watered by envy and pride, was silently growing within Cain's heart. Though God had warned him, though the evil lurked, ravenous, Cain did not rise up to fight the corruption within. Instead, he surrendered as one who willingly lays down in the beast's jaws. The invitation to sin did not come with a deafening roar, but as a persistent whisper, a soft tug that became overwhelming simply because Cain refused to resist it. Thus, he devised in secret the irreversible act. He lured Abel into the field where the lonely plains and the silence of nature would conceal the crime burning in his mind. Abel, pure in heart, trusted his brother, unaware of the darkness moving behind Cain's eyes. The field, once a place of labor and blessing, was about to be stained by the first human blood ever shed upon the earth. There, away from the eyes of their parents, far from any visible witness, Cain rose against Abel. There was no fair fight. There was no defense. The blow was cowardly and brutal, not just against Abel's body, but against all that he represented: faith, obedience, and God's favor. Cain did not merely slay Abel's flesh, he tried to silence the living testimony that condemned him by its very existence. In that moment, sin triumphed. Cain's fatal decision was no accident nor a blind impulse. It was the result of deliberate choice to embrace anger over humility, envy over reverence, hatred over repentance. And so the earth, which had received the breath of life from the Creator, now drank the blood of the righteous, becoming the silent witness and unwilling accomplice to human violence. The cry of this crime rose beyond the desolate field. It ascended to heaven as an unstoppable lament, as a charge that could not be silenced, for innocent blood speaks. Before God, and Abel, though dead, still spoke. Cain's decision sealed not only his own fate, but also inaugurated an age of corruption, a plague that would spread across the human heart. By surrendering to sin, Cain marked not only his personal story, but the story of all humanity. From that day on, murder, hatred, and rebellion would weave themselves into the legacy of Adam's children. The invitation to evil, rejected in a single moment, could have been the beginning of redemption, accepted. It became the fountainhead of an endless river of sorrow, flowing until the day a new Abel, the perfect lamb, would be slain unjustly to redeem the fallen. In Cain's solitary decision, the earth learned to weep, and the heavens learned to groan under the burden of human injustice. Sin, once merely crouching at the door, had now enthroned itself within the human heart, and from that moment on, the history of man would be written not only with words, but with tears and blood. The murder of Abel, the first blood, shed upon the earth. The field, once a place of labor and hope, had become the dark stage for the most terrible act ever committed under heaven. In the moment Cain raised his hand against his brother, the universe, still echoing the voice of divine creation, trembled under the weight of the first human death. Abel, the faithful shepherd, fell defenseless, a victim of the rage Cain dared neither confess nor conquer. The blood crafted by God to pulse with life now seeped into the earth, crying out for justice. Death entered the world, not with a thunderous roar, but with the cutting silence of betrayal and hatred. It was not a battle between equals. It was the cowardly brutality of a brother silencing the shame of his own spiritual failure. In Cain, humanity first saw the true face of sin, not merely disobedience, but deliberate murder, the shattering of brotherhood, and rebellion against the very order of creation. Abel's blood spilled across the hardened ground, sinking into the earth like a cursed seed. The soil entrusted to man as a gift and responsibility was now forced to drink the proof of his corruption. From that blood-stained ground rose the first cry for justice, crossing the distance between the fallen earth and the throne of God. For human life, molded in the image of the Creator, could not be taken without shaking the heavens. And God heard, not because he needed to be informed, but because the blood of the innocent bears weight before him. Abel, though silent in death, spoke louder than he ever could in life. His blood cried out, not just against Cain, but against every future system of injustice that would scar the earth. There, in that silent and blood-stained field, humanity learned a lesson time would never erase. Life is sacred. God's justice is unyielding. Sin's power is devastating. The first bloodshed would not be the last. It was merely the beginning of a long history of violence and tears, a history that would continue until a blood infinitely more precious would be shed to redeem all that had been lost. Cain, standing over the lifeless body of his brother, did not face merely Abel's death. He faced the death of his own humanity. He had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. No longer simply a man, he had become the first bearer of blood upon the earth. The field, intended to bear fruit for life, now bore witness to death, born from a hardened heart. The murder of Abel was not merely the first crime, it was the mark of a humanity that, born in disobedience, now matured in violence. From that moment forward, the sword would too often replace the word, and guilt, fear, and wandering would become humanity's bitter inheritance. Divine judgment, the curse, the mark, and the sentence of a wanderer. The earth still reeked with the blood of Abel, when the voice of the Eternal came upon Cain, not a cry for revenge, but the inevitable call of justice. "Where is your brother Abel?" asked the Lord, not for lack of knowledge, but to draw from Cain's hardened heart a confession that might open a path for mercy. Yet even in the presence of the Almighty, Cain answered with cold insolence, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" His face, already stained by guilt, now hardened into a mask of defiance. Faced with Cain's refusal to acknowledge his sin, God pronounced the sentence. The blood of Abel, hidden from human eyes, cried out from the earth, and its voice was inescapable. Cain was now cursed, not only from the ground he had worked, but by the very crime he had written into it with his hands. The land, which had resisted Adam because of original sin, would now be utterly barren for Cain. Though he sowed, he would not reap. His bond with the earth was forever broken. He would become a fugitive and a wanderer upon the earth. The sentence was not merely physical, it was existential. Cain, who had chosen death for his brother, would now live a death. In life, exile, restlessness, severed from both man and God. The mark of his crime would become his new identity. Terrified by the weight of his condemnation, Cain finally bowed, not in repentance, but in despair. "My punishment is more than I can bear," he cried. He did not mourn his sin, only his suffering. He feared being killed by others, becoming the victim of the same violence he had unleashed. Yet, even in judgment, God revealed his mercy. He placed a mark on Cain, a mysterious sign of protection that would preserve his life. It was both a judgment and a grace. Cain would wander, but he would not be destroyed. He would bear the heavy burden of his sin, but under the sovereign hand of God. Thus Cain departed, driven eastward to the land of Nod, a name forever tied to wandering and exile. Cain's judgment left a scar upon human history. It revealed that sin cannot be hidden, that injustice will be answered, but that even then, God's mercy limits the extent of destruction. Cain, marked and wandering, became the living symbol of the terrible consequence of unrepented sin, a life without peace, without place, without God. His story would stand as a warning to every future generation. The path of pride and violence leads not to freedom, but to the deepest captivity, the exile of the soul, wandering without rest. Eternal consequences, Cain's lineage, and the rise of violence. Cain left the presence of the Lord, and as he built his life away from the gaze of God, he laid the foundations for a lineage not marked by a search for righteousness, but by the spread of the corruption first born within him. In the land of Nod, the wanderer became a city builder, trying to replace lost communion with God through human achievements. Thus, his son Enoch was born, and with him the first city, Aphos Ois, desperate attempt to root himself in the cursed soil. Cain's genealogy quickly grew, and with each generation, the distance from God deepened. His descendants were not simply multiplying across the earth, they were becoming the architects of a society built on violence, arrogance, and self-sufficiency. Tubal-Cain, for example, became a master of bronze, and iron, the dominion over metals, also meant dominion over war and death. Arts and sciences flourished, but without the fear of the Lord, they became instruments of greater sin. Among Cain's descendants stood Lamech, a man whose recorded song became humanity's first hymn to vengeance and murder. He boasted of killing a man for a wound, promising 70 times more vengeance than that promised to Cain. Music, created for beauty and worship, had now become a tool to glorify violence. Thus, Cain's lineage did not merely bear the burden of the first murder, they propagated a culture of oppression, arrogance, and cruelty. The spirit of Cain, self-reliance, pride, and brutality became the invisible foundation upon which civilization was being built. Yet, even amid the growing darkness, hope was not extinguished. God gave Adam and Eve another son, Seth, a replacement for Abel. Through Seth's line, unlike Cain's, humanity would once again begin to call on the name of the Lord. Where Cain's descendants sought to establish themselves by strength, Seth's would preserve the seed of promise, the hope of redemption. The rise of violence proved that sin was no isolated tragedy, but a venom passed from generation to generation, unless confronted by grace and the fear of God. The earth, silent witness of those early days, now bore not only seeds of grain and fruit, but also the blood, cries, and burdens of a humanity choosing to build far from its Creator. Thus, Cain's story did not end with his own exile. It lives on wherever the voice of violence replaces that of mercy, wherever pride eclipses obedience, wherever human works try in vain to substitute the lost blessing of Eden. The earth stained by Abel's blood would never be the same. Cain's crime did not end with him. It became inheritance, culture, and pattern. The wandering, violent spirit he unleashed swept across generations like wildfire across the fields and cities that men built. And yet, even amid condemnation and exile, the mercy of God still flickered like embers beneath the ashes, the line of Seth would rise as a thread of light weaving hope amid the darkness, preparing the way for the one who, much later, would offer his own blood to restore what was lost in Abel's field. Cain's tragedy stands as a mirror before every human heart. It reveals that the battle between life and death begins within, and that every generation, like the first murderer, must choose to be mastered by sin or to bow in faith before the God who still calls, still warns, and still extends his hand.